Of course, this is Linux, and within Linux we should know there's always more than one way to skin a cat. Rather than going through and restarting our server, which of course is going to temporarily make the server unavailable, even be it for a short amount of time, we're also going to lose our cache. So we're able, as we've seen within the previous video, to use the RNDC tool to effect and load changes. As we go through, we can use the reload command to RNDC, and we might choose to use sudo to the bind account rather than root, as the bind account has most writes through to the DNS server. With reload, we're reading the configuration and all zones, but maintaining our cache. If we only need to reload a single zone, then we can do that by mentioning the zone the way it's referenced within the configuration file. If we need to clear the cache but don't need to load any other configuration information, we can use RNDC flush. And then as we've seen, that if we need to toggle on and toggle off the query log category, we can do that through RNDC query log. And of course, we can read that through the status subcommand. We also need to make sure that the bind user, or whichever user account is being used by the service, has the correct permissions. And of course, this could be the ownership, so making sure the directory and files are owned by the bind user, or on CentOS, it's going to be the user named. Checking our discretionary access control list. So this is going to include the mode of our files and directories, as well as any access control list, either the traditional access control lists or the NFS version 4 access control lists. But of course, not just stopping at access control lists, we also have our mandatory access control list systems, which then go beyond what we're able to do within our file system rights, but actually by saying the context of the service or the context of the file. One of the reasons why I left the log file within the var cache bind directory is that the bind user has rights to be able to create and manage and write files within that directory. Whereas if I did it through the var log directory, it would have failed because the AppArmor policy in our Ubuntu system wouldn't allow the bind user to create files within that directory. And in the same way, if we're using SE Linux, we have to make sure the context of the file is correct so that it can be managed by the bind user within the log directory. So certainly these other considerations, both our standard permissions and ownerships, as well as then looking at our mandatory access control systems of SE Linux and AppArmor. No matter which permission mechanism is generating the error, we should be able to see permission denied messages appearing through our logging mechanisms. So as we've walked our way through this module, we've been able to take a look at resource records. And of course, we were looking at different types of aliases. So starting off with our canonical names, our CNAME entries, and then looking at round robin entries and seeing that we can create round robin entries, but they might not work as round robin, because if we're coming from the same network, we're going to be given the priority of the record that is on the same network that we are on. But outside of that, then they are going to be assigned alternately. And we saw that if necessary, we could start creating TXT records. And these TXT records can be used then for our address records to try and allow some level of descriptive element to it. Don't forget the trailing periods. So we saw that if we put in what we thought should be a fully qualified name, but didn't have the trailing period at the end, then we will append the $origin, giving us something like ns1.example.com.example.com. By default, we use the syslog daemon for login, but we can then turn on our own direct login to get a little bit more control over it. And if we need to turn on the category for our query logging, we can do that through the rndc command directly. And of course, the rndc command, as we've seen, gives us the most flexibility when looking at reloading or restarting the service. And we finished up by making sure that we understood the need for the correct ownership of log files, configuration files, zone files, and making sure that we are using mandatory access control systems on top of our standard permissions, that both the permissions allow access as well as the mandatory access control system such as SE Linux and AppArmor. When we're looking at the standard permissions, we included that our standard mode as well as any extended access control list that we might be using. Next up, we're going to be looking at how we can start creating our slave or secondary servers and replicating our DNS zones, or what's known as our zone transfers.